We'll really be learning something today, maybe that, well, it's vital, to me, it's vital to know about this legislation that's to protect the river. So I'm hoping it's not going to take a lot of your time, right, Phil? He says, no, he's not going to take a lot of your time. But I think it'll be, and if you have questions afterwards, he's open to having questions about climate issues and legislation issues. So come on over. And I want to thank you so much for taking time to be here to attend our UUCC's Climate Action Team Forum on the Ulster County legislation for the rights of the Hudson River. And we are grateful to Ulster County Legislator Phil Erner for being here to educate us on local law number 12 of 2022, rights of the residents of Ulster County to clean water and for the rights of the Hudson River. Phil represents District 6 and is on the Health, Human Services, and Housing Committee, and Public Works, Capital Projects, and Transportation Committee. Also, he is the legislative representative for the Agricultural and Farmland Protection Board. Phil, I look forward to learning about this vital legislation and the current status. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Karen, for that introduction and inviting me here. And it is my privilege to be here with you, Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Catskills. Thank you so much. And I just caught the end of that beautiful service. Looks like it was based in more where I grew up. I didn't grow up in Ulster County. I grew up in the Capital District, about 50 miles north of here. And I saw on your program, you had heard from Leah Penniman, who I have the privilege to call a friend as a fellow farmer. And the remarks that the second to last pastor made around, we have the blessings are already here really resonated with me this morning. So before I tell you about the law, just by way of introduction, I'd like to say, just make clear that I am not an expert. I am not an expert on water. I am not an expert on the rights of nature. I'm not an expert on land. I'm not an expert on local history. But maybe I can share with you instead my conversations that I have had. Dances and songs and poetry. But the conversations with lawyers and bureaucrats and other elected officers, with advocates, friends and foes and frenemies. But I'm just one person. You all may be experts yourselves. In fact, you are experts in your own relationships with water and your own relations. This morning, getting ready to come here, I took a shower, and I was thinking that water comes from Cooper Lake. And here we are, right along the pipeline where that water comes down from Cooper Lake in Woodstock, halfway to my home in city, Kingston. That water that I use to cleanse my body today itself has come under recent threat from a photovoltaic array to generate electrical power being proposed in this town. So sometimes it gives me pause to recognize what we might think of as a solution can cause another problem. But on this day in which I took a shower in the morning, it was also raining. And as my friend Donna Cohen says, why do we run from the rain, but we don't run from our showers? And so I'm grateful to have come here to speak with you today on this rainy spring day of rebirth and renewal. I have just celebrated a Passover, Pesach, as in my Jewish tradition. My ancestors In ancient Israel, this was the time when the season would change from rain to dew, and so we would say a prayer, hoping that the dew would come to help us grow this year's food. Yesterday, my partner Rebecca and I planted peas, beans, a little early for that, calendula, it grows itself, and milk thistle. But I'm a newcomer still here. I'm only the fourth generation on this land when my ancestors arrived on this continent. So I urge us all to think about our relationship with that and our history personally with that. So as one person, I still have to learn how the seasons go here. And part of how I learn is to ask those who've been here and studied it and watched it and know. I also have the good fortune to have come to Ulster County to farm, and so I've cultivated that relationship since 2014 in that way. I want to acknowledge a couple of other names for the places we call home around here. Lenape-Hoking, a name by the Esopus Munsee Lenape people, and some others whom I've met who come from some of the First Nations histories and traditions around here, such as John Brinks up on Eagle's Nest, in the town of Hurley. Evan Pritchard of the Algonquin Center, Neetop Keetop, Evan who has authored Native New Yorkers and Henry Hudson the Algonquins, discussing a possible history of the encounters from the point of view of the local folks. Donna Cohen, who I mentioned earlier, and Debbie and the whole gang at Spirit of Thunderheart, the all-women Native drumming group, and their friend Brenda. Donna, who's of Native ancestry locally and farther upstate and inland as well, and who taught me the Six Nations Thanksgiving address, which includes an acknowledgement of the water. Atherhackton is a previous name for part of present-day city of Kingston. And so, as I said, I arrived here in 2014 on the Hurley Flats and the Esopus Creek. That's when I met Neetop Keetop. And some of you are familiar with that group, which formed after a journey upon the waters from Six Nations Confederacy land to the southern part of what's now New York, Lenape lands, to commemorate a treaty 400 years earlier between the Dutch and the First Peoples here. My friends Sally and Paul, the pastors Miles, J.D. and Charlene, and Paul Tobin have also influenced where I have arrived at this moment on these matters from that group. And then there's Lisa Mitten and Creek Iverson. Creek is my old friend who is in part directly responsible for my being able to move down here 50 miles from my birthplace, but more about that later. And since coming here, I've also I have met from the Ramapo Lenape, Owl, and Chief Dwayne Perry. And I'm aware that Chief Vincent Mann and Paul Tobin have introduced to the City of Kingston Common Council rights of the water and a river acknowledgement. So I encourage you to look into all those, or we can talk about more later about what I know that's going on around those. And then be remiss not to mention the Stockbridge Munsee people who Curtis of the Lenape Center has recently been starred in a film of his homecoming. He had grown up in what's now Oklahoma and has relations also out in Wisconsin, but the Stockbridge Munsee, we know Stockbridge in Massachusetts, that and points west over here are more where those folks had lived before. Right by the congregation where we all are right now flows the so-called Esopus Creek, and just south of here lie the Hurley Flats. For centuries, if not millennia, these lands have nourished us, and the waters have flooded them, providing rich, fertile soil from which we draw our sustenance. And I had the opportunity to farm there when I first arrived here. But some 350 years ago, a disruption happened. When I came here, I lived in a stone house, which had been built around 1670. by the DeWitts and another Dutch family, but also enslaved people, many of whose names we won't know. But at least one relation we do, and a century after that, Sojourner Truth roamed these lands and taught us so much about how we can become free. Her enslavers were related to the Dutch folks whose house I lived in so many centuries later. So, last thing before I get into this local law that you've come to hear about, as Donna once again teaches, I'm only human. We're only human. We're born to make mistakes. So whatever I leave out, please know it was not my intention. I'm human and I'm meant to make mistakes. Proposed local law number 12 of 2022 in the Ulster County Legislature. A group of residents of Connolly, some of whom I had known from other contexts, Lee Guff, for example, came to me and said, "We got a problem. We drink our water from the Hudson River, and that's coming under threat. We've had a problem here in Connolly in the town of Esopus for a long time. Many people who live in this little hamlet across from the Strand in Kingston have gotten cancer or other illnesses that we wonder what it must be, but it has to have something to do with the water that flows through here, the Rondout Creek, and where we're drinking out of in the Hudson. We have an immediate threat of a power cable that's coming down from a hydroelectric dam, several dams, in fact, hundreds, close to 1,000 miles north of here in Canada, on territory where that first of all, the people who lived there before never said it was okay for you to do these things, to come in here and claim it and claim ownership over it. But second of all, even though you did that, now you've dammed this all up. You've flooded the lands. You've taken the cycles that had existed before and really disrupted them. And it's hard for us to sustain our communities, let alone the other natural communities around here. And Lee and Nina and others said, we don't want to be a part of that. We don't want to be a part of that. And how would we be a part of it? We would be a part of it because this power cable would take electricity generated on these dammed up rivers and transmit it through our community on its way to New York City. We want to be a part of it because these dams, has been shown, generate a ton, like literal tons of greenhouse gases. And we're talking methane, we're talking, as the planet warms, more water vapor, which is a positive feedback loop that generates more water vapor as things heat up. We can't be a part of any of this, and we'd like you to try and stop it. And here's how we propose you do that. I'm like, oh, really? Just that? That's all. So this local law effort began with community groups that Lee and Nina and Leah and Pamela and others in town of Esopus formed, called the Eco Assembly. And it started with advocates like Food and Water Watch. It started with Riverkeeper more than a decade ago, the Clearwater, Beacon Sloop Club, Hudson River Maritime Museum. These organizations all do their part to protect the water, largely so that humans can enjoy it, can use it as a resource. We can drink from it, we can play in it, we can do commerce. But the Eco Assembly taught me one thing, which is we need to go a step farther. If we want to get real about what it's going to take to protect the river, not just for ourselves, but for our posterity, then we need to recognize that the river is older than we are, and that it has a wisdom that we can't possibly ever comprehend. but we know that it must possess of what we have created in our legal system we call rights. And what is a right? A right says this is something that I get to do, or that you can't stop me from doing, or I cannot be violated. It might be as simple as a right to exist, but it might be something like a right to flourish or to thrive. So this idea intuitively appealing to me, okay, all right, dig, but how do we do that? How do we make a law about that? Don't we have the federal government making laws, Environmental Protection Agency? Don't we have the state government? Didn't we, as the voters of New York State, approve a constitutional amendment in 2021 saying that the people of New York have the right to clean air, water, and a healthful environment? What about all of that? Well, it turns out that despite all of that, despite the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019 that the state legislature passed with leadership from then state senator and our present county executive, Jen Metzger, despite all of that, we can still have a power cable trenched in the Hudson River on the spine of the river that generations ago was dug out so that big ships could come through, and the sediment deposited on all the banks and disrupting a lot of what was happening in the ecosystems there. So it turns out that despite all of our laws, these things are still allowed to happen. And then farther down the river, which flows both ways and in fact is an estuary, right? And it's an arm of the sea. It has salt up at least past Newburgh, sometimes into Poughkeepsie. It has tides up to the Troy Dam. You can go downtown Albany and they'll have a chart saying, here's the high tides for the day and the low tides, just like you're on the ocean. We can still have radiological discharges into that estuary, into that living being that is this river. So maybe we need another law that can prevent that. That's the idea. That's the basic idea. So, where did we go from there? Other groups I would like to mention that are working on this include ROAR, which is a group of a faith group that has meetings more centered in the Bronx, but all up and down the river. And I believe it's called Religious Organizations Around the River. We have the CELDF, which I couldn't tell you what that stands for, but it is an advocacy group that is nationwide, urging folks to think differently about their rights and responsibilities in a republic, and how the Constitution was not actually set up very well to protect those, but it does give us a right for the people to govern themselves in local communities and make determinations about what's best for them. And in other words, to have the right to protect things and places and people more so than the higher levels of government. That's part of what the United States Constitution does do, although it is quite a fraught document in that organization's and my own personal opinion. So the Eco Assembly figures out how are we going to strategize to pass a law that's stronger than the state or federal laws. And they find this other organization called the Center for Democratic Environmental Rights, and they bring in an attorney, and he starts to help them craft a law. So just to be clear, this law is not something I wrote. It is something that the people of Ulster County wrote with some help from attorneys who have some experience with this. What kind of experience are we talking about? Well, we have rights of nature elsewhere. And rights of nature, again, just to say it simply and briefly, it's acknowledging that a river or a mountain range or a forest has inherent rights, rights being a term that we are familiar with in our Western legal system, and they can't be violated or else, just like your right to free speech or of assembly can't be violated or else. This movement is quite old, although its modern incarnation has been shaped domestically by the Standing Rock Sioux and by folks in Pennsylvania who were trying to prevent hydraulic fracture gas waste from being deposited in their town, and the residents of Ohio on Lake Erie who sought to keep their lake clean. Remember that, I don't remember this, but if you were around in the 1970s, you might remember the lake caught on fire. So this is coming from generational experience that people have with, what are we doing? What are we doing? The Maori people in what the English call New Zealand have protected a river. I believe it was the first legally protected river in the world. Countries south of here in the Western Hemisphere, such as Ecuador, have made efforts to protect their rainforests from polluters such as Chevron. And in Colombia, a group of youth sued the government saying, you are not doing enough to protect us, the next generation. And you know what the court did? They actually came back and said, you know what, you're right. And also the whole Amazon tributary system that flows into our country has rights as well. Thanks, kids. And Virginia is one of the first states to recognize the disproportionate impact of pollution on Black, Indigenous, and low-income communities in this country. So folks in Esopus get this law drafted, we get ready to submit it. Meanwhile, word's getting around. And we're not the only ones talking in this part of Ulster County or the county at large or even the region about how do we protect from these specific threats? How do we protect the river generally? Letters started coming in of support. We're hearing from the Quassaic Creek Watershed Alliance based in Orange County, but the Quassaic Creek actually originates in Ulster County. And they have resolved that to support our legislation. They, like Riverkeeper, have a wide range of reasons that people join. Some for sporting, some for, you might call like generalized environmental protection, but their support of other groups is really crucial, as you know, in getting legislation passed. We have a letter here from the Democratic Socialists of America. We have letters from Columbia County residents, from Greene County residents, from the Bronx, from Rockland County. They in Westchester have led the charge to stop the radiological discharges in their immediate area as a function of decommissioning Indian Point. And Holtec, the corporation and responsible for that, it looks like at least it's on hold for now, and perhaps the state legislation that has been proposed and that we in the county government unanimously asked the state to pass hopefully would prevent any sort of discharge like that in rivers in this state. But just so you know, the federal government does have some control over that. And so that's something I can talk more about. What do we get preempted by on the county level by New York State, and what does the state get basically overruled by the federal government in its attempts to do things? Yeah. So, but why, even if that's all the case, even if the state says, you know what, it's better that we can put this power cable in the river because New York City needs electricity not from this nuclear plant that's shutting down or from frack gas plants. So if that's what the state thinks and that's what the Public Service Commission believes and votes for, then there's legally only so much we can do on the county level. That constitutional amendment, though, is a bit of the key, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. We have support from the North Country as well. Up in Potsdam and Canton, they have passed memorializing resolutions. A memorializing resolution means that this is something that we believe in or want some other government entity to do, but we can't do ourselves, or we're not doing ourselves. It doesn't have the force of law. It's our opinion. But opinion or not, there is support building for protecting the Racket River, for protecting the St. Lawrence River, and all associated waterways in the Adirondacks, which we know have suffered from acid rain and had been clear cut and are recovering, just like the Hudson River. They are recovering. So let us continue that recovery, is the thought of this local law and its proponents. I mentioned the county executive. Executive Metzger set forth as her first executive order a 14-point order regarding implementation of the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So in other words, in 2019, the state passed this law saying we have to protect the community from climate catastrophe, and our county executive here in Ulster County is now saying, here are the steps Ulster County is going to take for doing that. I see that as a model for us in the legislature, and our council, who I'm working with on it, on Local Law 12, Dave Gordon, agrees. We can use the so-called Green Amendment that y'all voters passed in 2021 to say, well, if the people of New York State have the right to clean air, water, and a healthful environment, we can say that here in Ulster County, that means so forth and so on, and X, Y, and Z. For example, that means you can't dump in the Hudson River. That means you can't put a cable in the Hudson River that's going to disrupt the fish and going to disrupt boats and going to disrupt the drinking water. You can't do it actually because it's not the morally correct thing to do. We could say that if we wanted to. So before I finally getting into the central part of the law here, this law is currently in the Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Committee of the legislature, which I sat on last year and I got off of. And I'm happy to share briefly. Part of the reason was this connects to the law and the reason we need a law like this, in my opinion. I see the environmental protections and responsibilities of that committee to be really all over the place and really difficult to, I want to say it's like balkanized or segmented in such a way that it makes it, in my experience of just a year, but enough to feel as though it's very difficult to accomplish a whole lot. So I leave that up to you, and for another conversation, we can talk more about what might be the way forward in correcting that. But for now, that committee is the one that has to agree that this law is a good idea and pass it, as does the Laws and Rules Government Services Committee. Both those committees have 5 members, and the committee members in Energy Environment have asked excellent questions. Well, what does this bind us to do? What does this require of us? It says we have to take any and all measures to protect this river and the rights of the people to a clean river and the rights of the river itself to be clean and flourish. What does that mean? How much is that going to cost? Who's responsible for doing this? Let me say one thing. It's not individual people of Ulster County. This law is not really meant to regulate y'all's behavior as individual residents of the county. This is meant to keep bigger entities like corporations, which have rights now under our Constitution, right? And other levels of government that don't have the same respect that we do for our rivers. This is meant to tell them, you can't do all these things that you want to do. That's its purpose. So before I wrap up and ask for questions, so I have a copy of the law here in case you haven't seen it. We can pass it around. And it's kind of, in some ways it's very straightforward, and in other ways it has some very technical terms in there. And that's one thing that the lawyers might have to hash out. But I believe that a good law is one that anybody can understand. It's very simple. So I'm hoping that in the end, we get the protection that we want from a simple, clear law that anybody can understand. And I'm feeling hopeful. There's a lot of good minds who have done a lot of great work within the government for a long time around protecting the water, who are behind this. They might have their different ideas about how we get there. But I'm hoping that the will of the people who brought this, and so many folks who have shown up in support of this, will prevail. And we will get the right of both the people of Ulster County to a clean and healthy Hudson River and its tributaries and watershed, and also acknowledge, even if it's just an acknowledgement, that the river itself does have rights. So I'll pause there and ask for any questions, please.
You say it's in committee at the moment.
Yes.
What is that? Is there anything that public can encourage it to get out of committee for a vote, or what?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Karen. So what it means in committee is that this committee will have to, a majority of the 5 members, so 3 of them would have to vote in favor of the law in order for it to continue. And after that, it would go to the Laws and Rules Committee. The Laws and Rules Committee usually waits about local laws until the Committee of Original Jurisdiction. In other words, if it's about energy, or if it's about economic development, or if it's about housing, they want to hear from that committee first. Like, does this make sense to promote housing in Ulster County, or promote education, or in this case, protect the river? And if they think so, then the Laws and Rules Committee would consider it. Now, the law as it's currently written is subject to revision. It might, and one of the reasons for that, as I mentioned, is we want it to do what we want it actually to do what we want, which is that it needs to protect the water better than we're protecting it now. It needs to protect particularly drinking water. It needs to prevent entities like corporations from acting with impunity and damaging the river. And it needs to provide a way, if that does happen, to restore the river. And again, what I'm hearing from the public, and what I hope it will do, is acknowledge we can't grant rights to the river. The river has rights, right? We can't really grant rights to each other as human beings, even through law either, because we have these, and all we can do is for our laws to acknowledge what these rights are and then provide mechanisms to protect them. But we don't create the rights. The rights come from nature or from God or from our relationships with each other. They're not, right? They're not really things that we fabricate. At least I don't believe that they are. But they are things that we can acknowledge and protect. Did I answer your question?
No, so from that committee,
Yes.
we'll go to Laws and Rules.
Yes.
And that goes back to the committee that's focused on water, or, and then revisions of it. And then it'll be brought to the floor. So
It's possible that it can just pass those 2 committees and go right to the floor. It could fail those committees, but 6 legislators could sign what's called a petition of discharge, and it can go straight to the floor, even failing the committees. The revisions, the law has recently changed, I believe, statewide recently, so we have to have a public hearing in Ulster County to pass any local law. And the hearing, we hope, would have the final language of the law as we would propose it to be. But when we had a hearing of making affordable housing a public purpose of Ulster County just 2 sessions ago, members of the public turned out and gave suggestions that we then actually we changed the law after that. And it used to be you have to have a new public hearing. You don't anymore. You can just pass the law with the changes after you've had that one hearing. And that is in fact what we did last week. And we passed that local law. So it could go either way. To your question, Karen, it could be that the changes happen all before the committee votes. It could happen after that goes to public hearing. I'll tell you, if we get this to a public hearing, we're doing pretty well.
Okay.
We're doing pretty well.
Okay. And how is that decision made to get to a public?
These committees either pass it or the full legislature has to pass. So the first step, again, is you set a public hearing on a local law, and that has to pass the full legislature and probably these committees. And then after the public hearing, it goes back to us the following month, and then we decide whether to enact the law. Yes, hi.
Yes, so I admit that being pretty confused here about the different steps. I want to know what action I can take and when it would be possible to have a public hearing.
Okay, great, thank you. So months ago, when we first were bringing this to the committee, I had urged supportive members of the public or opposing members of the public, frankly, but anybody who had a comment to send it to the Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Committee. So I urge anyone here who hasn't looked at the law yet to please do so, and then you can do that. Now, I believe that the committee members do look at the letters of support or questions that folks send. That said, that of course is no guarantee that they're going to support it. It would have to convince them that it's a good idea. So not only that, so one strategy would be to send this letter, but another strategy would be some legislators, in my experience, are happy to, if they think the law is pretty good, there might be like a rough thing or two, but it's more or less okay, but they don't want to delay it. They'll say, okay, we'll send this to a public hearing and we'll hear from the public what they think of it. And that is a really great opportunity to weigh in, because legislators, in my experience, do listen when the public shows up in chambers for the monthly session. So, yes. Yeah, the public hearing is typically held just at the start of each monthly session, and monthly session is usually the third Tuesday of each month. December is a little different, but the rest of the year, and January is a little different too, but we're in the part of the year where that's what it'll be. And
Is it listed in the paper?
it should be listed in the newspaper. If you use the internet, it's on the legislature's website, but I'm happy to make sure that you know when those hearings are and when those sessions are. Thank you. And so just in terms of the process of this possibly going through, I don't know if it will be ready for the committee this month to pass it on. I'm planning to work some more, hopefully this week, with legislative counsel. But I would invite you, I'm hoping to have another public informal meeting, and our counsel has been open to this before, where he and another lawyer who had worked with the folks from Connolly were talking. No, I'm sorry, it wasn't that lawyer. It was a different advocate from the other organization I mentioned. But he's going to talk with this other lawyer. I've given him permission, because he works for me as a legislator, to also open that to the public. And that, as long as there aren't a quorum of legislators from a committee or of the whole body, it's not considered official business, but it can still be open, and I can invite you all to come. So I'm happy to, whether through Karen or whomever, to convey when that's going to be, so you can follow the process along and ask questions of these attorneys who are helping fine tune the law, shall we say. Did I answer your question?
the information to you, Abby. Abby, I'll get you the information directly.
Thank you, Carolyn.
By
And thank
telephone.
you.
You're welcome, Abby.
I know, Abby. It's telephone.
Other questions? Yes, please.
So the text of the law, is that available online?
It is.
Is that, so you're saying it may change, but, this is pretty much what we came up with the groups and lawyers.
It might change, and like I said, it might be a matter of moving some of it from the resolved, which says this is what the county has to do, to the whereas, which is like, this is the justification for why we're doing what we're doing. A couple other changes might happen, but yes, the current official text of what's being proposed is available on the county legislature's website, and anything that has to pass will have to show up there, unless it's amended at the last minute, which sometimes happens. But for something like a local law, it's considered bad form and not very probable that it would pass with amendments at the last minute. It's the sort of thing that needs to be done in advance. Did I answer your question?
Yes, well, my feeling is it's hard for me to really even talk about it until I read it, I guess.
Fair enough. Let me find my copy here and I can send it around while we're finishing our discussion. Is this it? Yes, you can.
Hand it to her so she can just look at it.
Yeah, I'm gonna find it. Yeah, I'm gonna find it and pass it around.
But it's on the website. It's on the website, the county website.
Here it is. Who wants it first?
I was hoping to see Teddy, and I hope he said he wanted to come. But it's recorded.
Does anyone else have any questions about it? Or anything else going? I heard, Marge, you had asked if I was here to talk in general about climate legislation and what's going on with the climate in the county, and I'm happy to report further what I know about that as well. Or if you had any specific questions about other legislation.
So I just wanted to say a couple things. First of all, you mentioned two aspirations, I guess, with regard to this law, and I wish you all the best with regard to both of those. The first has to do with declaring rights for a river itself, not for the people that are advocating for the river, which is not, as far as I know, yet happened in this country. It happened in New Zealand, as you said, and it would be a huge, breakthrough in the law to actually give rights to non-human entities, or at least humans to advocate for them. And the second thing is, you mentioned that you'd like to see this law made as simple as possible, and I wish you incredible luck with that. There's a famous quote in Napoleon's tomb. When Napoleon came into power, he changed all the laws of France and made them uniform. And the civil code comes out of that. And Napoleon said, I want to make the law simple and intelligible for all. And all that's happened ever since is that it's got more and more complex because lawyers take it over and everything else. Some of that's for the good because we want to be specific and we want to be able to say to the legislature, to the business, this is what you need to do and it's right here. Some of it really makes it almost impossible for any of us to understand. So good luck with both of those things.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Us all, because you're the ones who will have to live by it, right?
Right.
I understood that there is, throughout the country, a movement of this local law to protect nature. And do you know of any other areas in the country that have actually successfully passed this local law?
No, I think you're right, Mark. I think Mark's right. I think it hasn't, as such, rights of nature has not been a thing yet in the United States. And part of the reason is that from the US Constitution on down, we have nature is pretty much perceived as property, which has that sort of relationship with human beings. It's an object which we can exploit as resources, or maybe we have to protect, but it's seen in that lens. It's a very different conception of, like, the rights of nature is just mind-blowing to that sort of legal framework, right? Because the river doesn't have any rights of its own under that framework. It's there for us, but so we have to deal with that legal reality. We have to, and that's true in the state constitution too, despite the Green Amendment. So the idea might be, how can we use the fact that the will of the people now says, and the Constitution is a big deal. I mean, you can't have state laws or state offices that are doing things that contravene the state constitution. If the Department of Environmental Conservation is acting in such a way to violate the people's right to clean air, water, and a healthful environment, that's illegal now, like no matter what else. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's because the river has rights. It doesn't necessarily mean because the Catskill Mountains have rights. It doesn't necessarily mean because the brook trout has rights. But some of these advocacy and legal groups that have been working with folks here in Ulster County that want to pass this, it's their belief that by putting this out there and by asserting that these rights exist, whether our legal system acknowledges them or not, that someday it will. Hopefully soon.
Pamela, right? Often rights are associated with agency, and we don't understand what inanimate objects or whatever you call, objects to have agency. But it doesn't have to be linked that way. But historically, that's been the case. And of course, we have everything from creation myths on, that say that nature was here for us to dominate, right? Which also is something else we are fighting as well. So, and I think to set a precedent, Bill, would be absolutely great. And I don't, some other places like Berkeley, some of the more localized, more activist areas may have these things. I don't know, but at least on a national level, New Zealand is the only place that I know that's actually had a law that was upheld by the Supreme Court to say that a river has agency and it has rights.
This might be something that for folks to see too. This is called the Community Toolkit for Rights of Nature. And it explains some of the reasons why rights of nature is happening in other places, why it hasn't really been a thing yet in the United States. There's some, I'll say, strange news out of Western New York. One of the first court cases dealing with our Green Amendment, in which residents of a particular place near Rochester sued over this enormous landfill over there, saying you're violating our right to clean air and so forth. And the court ruling came back and was interesting. It said, and strange, it said the landfill itself is not violating the Constitution of New York State by doing whatever it's doing, but the State Department of Environmental Conservation is violating the Constitution by not protecting the people adequately. Yes.
Yes, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, Ulster County only borders part of the Hudson River. And how does this mess up what we're trying to do?
That's a really important question, Abby. Did everybody hear Abby's question? So we're still figuring that out is the short answer. Clearly, Ulster County doesn't have any direct jurisdiction over any other county. Dutchess County, Greene County, no whether we have a. But then we have to start thinking, well, okay, the river forms the boundary between Dutchess and Ulster County. So is there a part of the river that we do have some jurisdiction over? And right now where we're at is actually having to possibly look back to colonial law to see how that was granted to the different counties and what's happened since then. And it's an unanswered question at this point, Abby, and it definitely is creating some concern over whether the current text of the law is going to work if it's taken to court. That said, it's also very expansive. It covers tributaries, the watershed, almost the entirety of Ulster County lies within the Hudson River watershed. There's a little bit in Delaware watershed, but it's quite a lot of the county, and so that's another thing we have to think about, and where the watershed extends to, obviously, as well, north and south and east here too.
So maybe you guys should be talking to the other counties that border it and saying, don't you deserve clean water and healthful, environment? Is there any possibility that might be done?
Yes, Abby, you're absolutely right. So I have been talking with Dutchess County legislators. I've been talking with some Orange County legislators, Westchester and Rockland. There's some interest in those counties. I haven't spoken with anybody in Putnam yet, but downriver of here, there is increasing interest in this sort of thing as well. And I think ultimately that probably is what's going to have to happen for it to have force of law, is for a whole lot of counties all to say the same thing.
Now, there was a problem with GE and all the sludge, and that allegedly has been cleared up. Is there any kind of blessing or advantage in that?
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, are you referring to like farther north, up by like Fort Edward and all that, or where?
Well, I'm not sure where all the sludge landed, but I know there was allegedly cleaned up. PCBs. And wasn't there some kind of statement like this about the rights of the people there to have a clean river?
I don't know the answer to that.
But it might be helpful.
Yeah.
But you're right, it was also the state that got involved there, so the state would have jurisdiction over all the counties.
Who wants this?
I think, Kristen, you wanted to see this?
Well, I think I'll read it on my own time.
Could you just tell us what that document was, or where the one about,
This community toolkit for rights in nature,
Yeah.
this is from the Earth Law Center. I'll pass this around too.
I was wondering.
Yes.
I actually have visited with I live in the town of Sophus, and so my drinking water is going to be affected by this. And I've spoken to Danielle Freer, who's our superintendent, and she is very alarmed. She actually has an attorney who's working with her, because she recognizes that if this transmission line goes down the Hudson, this trippy, what you're speaking about is the Superfund site. The PCBs will be released, and so our water will be contaminated, and she'll have a crisis that she has to deal with. So she and Shannon Harris have been interacting with Hudson 7, and they are on YouTube. You can catch their monthly meetings, and their monthly meeting last Thursday, April 20th, involves Ryan Beck, supervisor, who's now on board, and 7 communities. I was wondering, were you able to talk with the Hudson 7 at all about this?
I have not personally done so yet.
Yeah.
However, I know some of your townsmates are on there regularly, and some of my constituents from the city of Kingston also have gone to Hudson 7 meetings. And they are open to the public, right? At least to listen, if not to make comments.
You can actually get on to their Zoom meetings, and you can submit questions. I actually wrote a letter to Danielle Freer requesting oversight, because she is the supervisor of the Port Ewan water and sewer that I pay. Been paying for like 25 years for my drinking and bathing water, which will be contaminated. And then we'll have if this happens, we'll have an emergency that she'll have to ask FEMA to come in, and we know how reliable FEMA is to provide drinking water for thousands of residents. But there's 2 things. There's also the radioactive waste that made front page news this week that is on hold, but they plan to dump huge amount into the Hudson, and that will come this way. And also after this, I'm going to a Mohawk consultant forum with Geocass and Ghost Horse and an attorney from Pace University, Robinson, and they're going to speak about the law and the language, and hopefully what you're doing, they will be hand in hand so there can be more connections. Just wanted to add that. So I do feel like this is a time when community, and I think our community right here, we can really give tremendous support to this. It's very exciting. Pete Seeger stood up against it back in the 90s, and it was stopped. And now it's returning. But I think I've also heard this law being considered like an affirmation, like something that, and I think it's important. They say, does it have teeth? Well, it has a heart and it has lips because we're speaking about it. It has a tongue. Does it have teeth? We don't know right now, but I think it's very important to have heart and be able to speak about this.
I wanted to also just offer, I brought copies of this. It's called Hoodwinked in the Hot House. They're over there for the taking. This is from, it's called Resist False Solutions to Climate Change. And it's also raising funds for the Indigenous Environmental Network. So if you feel so moved, you can make a contribution, but these are already paid for as well. So thanks for your attention, for having invited me. Really appreciate you.
I think